So what we're going to talk about today is Andrew Wyeth and realism. And what realism is basically it's the skill of making something look realistic, to make it look like a photograph. And it was a lot more prevalent pre-photography. Like people really tried to be good at drawing things realistically before photography. And then they went, well, if photography can do that, we should paint a different way. But there were a handful of artists who were like, no, we can make it better than photography. We can make it look more real. So you get into things like realism and hyperrealism, where people try to make things look realistic. What you need to do is ask yourself these questions. If you're trying to make something look realistic, how fast should you draw? Basically slow, because the slower you go, the more control you have over your hand and your eye connecting. So
you gotta take your time.
Yeah. And you know what? You won't always have to take your time, but if you're messing stuff up, like you'll get to a point where you get a lot quicker the more you draw, because you'll be able to tap into that right brain and you'll be able to observe things and you'll develop a link between your eye and hand. But there will be days, and I have them too, where I just start messing stuff up. And during those times, I ask myself this question: am I going too fast? And usually the answer is yes. All right. Number 2 question. What's the difference between a smiley face and your face? Every single one of your facial features, all those things are called details. So when you think about it, like if you start to draw somebody, or let's say you start to draw an eyeball, because people love drawing eyeballs. They're fascinated with eyes. You have to draw the shape of the eyeball. You have to draw the eyelid, where that ridge where the eyelashes sit. If they got bags under their eyes, you'll be drawing the bags. If they got wrinkles, you draw the wrinkles. You got a tear duct here in the middle. All right, so going back to that, whenever you draw something, you want it to look real. It's got to be these massive amounts of details. If they got bags under their eyes, you draw bags. If they got mole on their head, you draw a mole. If they got wrinkles, you draw wrinkles. If they got a bald spot, you draw the bald spot. If their beard is uneven from them leaning on it, you have to draw that uneven beard. All right? So all those things make up what a person looks like, and or makes up an object. If you have to draw a cabinet, you got to do the wood grain. You're supposed to do the wood grain in the pattern that it actually is. All right, so that second rule is details. All right, now here's a very ethereal question. Can you make something look real without seeing it? Normally I disagree with you, but when we started talking with my last class and I started talking about the way that Andrew Wyeth paints, he really does make things look real without even seeing them. But his method is a bit strange. So we're going to get into that. Normally, I feel you have to see the thing to see the details. Because like even if I tried to draw Homer Simpson right now, if I didn't have a picture of Homer, I'd mess him up. I know I would. I'd give him like Garfield's eyes because they're similar. And I know he ain't got no bump to the back of his neck or a jaw. But I would probably mess up his nose, like the stuff I don't really pay attention to when I look at Homer. So normally you need it there. But you're right. Andrew Wyeth is going to prove me wrong in a few minutes. All right. How often should you look at your paper? You should look probably at your object more. Because here's why. You get seduced by your paper. Because drawing's actually fun, especially if you're not trying to draw anything. You just start making stuff up. You're like, oh, this will go here and this will go here. And you're having a blast. But the problem is when you're trying to draw something realistic, you have to see the details. And if your head's buried in the paper, you're going to make details up. But I'm going to show you how that can all change. All right. So let's go back to Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth pretty much painted his whole life. He was the middle part of a painting legacy or a dynasty. And what I mean by that is his father was a famous painter. He was a very famous painter, and his son is a famous painter. He painted this painting, Christina's World, back in 1948. All right. Now, let's say I'm a blind guy and you have to tell me what's in this picture. And you're not going to be cruel and be like, there's lava and sharks. Because while that might look cool in my head, that's not what's in the painting. So if you had to use words to describe this, what would you say about it? Is it a lush green field or is it some other type of field? All right, excellent. So we've got this kind of cornfield colored grass, which looks dried out, right? There's no feeling like it's rained forever. So that's an important part of this painting, because if this was a lush green field, you would feel different about what's in this picture. It wouldn't look as stark if that field color was green. Yeah, it really does give you this kind of weird sense of something's not quite right. There's a very old barn in the back. There's a very old barn, our very old house. And somebody just pointed out the 2 tracks being cut through the grass. All right, good. So we're looking at the grass that's near the house has been cut, where the grass that she's in looks like they got let go. So at some point, whoever was cutting the grass decided this is about as much grass as I want to cut, and they just stopped, which I guess is fine. I mean, if they're not doing anything with that yard, why cut everything? But there's a lot of clues in this painting that tells us it wasn't painted yesterday. And if you could ignore the 1948 on the side of the picture, what clues tell you that this painting wasn't painted yesterday? All right, it's kind of all washed out colors. We don't see a single bright color in this thing. What else?
The dress.
It
The
looks
dress.
so depressing to look at.
Yeah, the dress on the girl looks like a 1950s diner, like a waitress outfit. It doesn't have any, it's got no flair to it. I remember my grandmother wearing dresses like that all the time. Even her shoes. If you take a close look at her shoes. Now, the one thing that somebody pointed out earlier, and I think it was Sydney, pointed out the 2 ruts in the front of the lawn. Most people have driveways now. Like, even if you live in the middle of nowhere, why would those two ruts in the dirt, be a bad way to drive your car up to your house? So if they had a heavy storm, you're not leaving until the dirt dries out. So you're kind of at the mercy of the weather. If you need groceries, you might have to walk to the store. Who knows how far it is? Could be 8-10 miles. So yeah, that's another key. Plus the house, you can tell it hasn't been painted, so the gray rot has started to take a hold of it. And while you see that on a lot of barns nowadays, most areas, even out in the country, have some kind of ordinance where you're like, no, you have to keep up your dwelling. You let your barn fall apart, but I have your house needs to be painted at least enough that it doesn't look like that. So there are clues in this that tells us what time period it's not recent. And it's definitely not in the time of the night. So we get a general idea of when it took place. Now here's the fun one. Why is that girl out in the field? And that's one of the keys to this painting. Her body language is very suggestive to the mood of this picture. Did she fall asleep in the field and not know where she was heading? And then she woke up and she's like, oh, the house. We don't know. Is this a happy picture or a sad picture, or it just seems very overcast? There's no blue to this sky. It's just haze. All the grass looks dead. The house is gray. Now, I love this painting for all those reasons you guys just said, because the fact that this guy could communicate this kind of sense of sadness and depression with just paint is amazing to me. Because I'm not one of those people that need to be happy all the time. I usually get annoyed when I'm happy. So, I'm not saying I'm emo, but it always seems so incredibly lonely. And I think I just find that amazing that he can paint that consistently, this weird sadness. Now I'm going to wreck your days and tell you why she's actually in the field. And I sometimes feel bad about this because when we come to a painting, we try to figure out what it's about um, without, without knowing anything. So there is a version that you came to this painting, looked at it, came up with your own ideas. And now I'm going to tell you why she's really out there, and your own ideas might make it a more enjoyable painting for you. It may make you like the painting more. Christina had polio. She could not walk. And she actually owned this house over here. And she made the majority of her money by renting out rooms. In the upper attic, she rented this to Andrew Wyeth when he was a younger man and he needed a studio to paint out of. Well, to get anywhere on the farm, Christina would have to drag her body to go get the mail or go feed the chickens or whatever she needed to do. She would drag her body through the field. Why wouldn't she use a wheelchair? So look, the time period is 1948 when this was painted, right? Think about how primitive wheelchairs had to be back then. The tires were probably not rubber. They were probably wood. And you've got these big ruts out here in your field, and your field's not even. So she would probably attempt it in her wheelchair, but her wheelchair would get stuck in a rut and she would throw herself face first into the ground, which is a bad way to spend your afternoon. So she'd pull herself, leave the wheelchair for inside the house. Now, one day, Andrew Wyeth was coming home from getting his paint supplies, and he saw her coming back from the mail. And she's just dragging herself like it ain't no big thing. And he's like, God, she's an amazing person, that she can just be like, I got to get there. See you in a minute. Drag, drag, drag. And he found this image so striking that he made her pose for it. He made her pose for this painting 332 times. He did 332 pre-sketches or drawings before he painted this. So by the time he got to painting it, he did not need to look at the details. He remembered all the details. That's amazing to me, because that means he had to move all of his right brain knowledge into his left brain as some sort of super inhuman symbol. And that's how he painted everything, is he would do hundreds of drawings so that he knew exactly what something looked like before he would paint it. So you're kind of right. You can draw something realistic without looking at it, but you have to look at it about 300 times before you can do that. If we take a close-up here on her ankle and her hand, you start to get the idea that this leg doesn't look very healthy. It's very pale. The shoe's all beat up, almost like it's there as a formality so her feet don't get cut. As you take a look at this hand, it's clutching at the ground. Which is probably what she had to do constantly. She'd grab a new chunk of dirt and pull herself forward. This is what the house looks like today. It's part of the historical preservation society because it is such a famous painting. You can see as you get closer to the house, there is a beautiful ridge of pine trees that are nice and green that are not in the photo, because he hadn't gotten close enough to the house to see them, and that the grass does have the ability to get green with rain. It would have been a completely different painting if it had those colors in there, or those pine trees. Now, Andrew Wyeth's dad was N.C. Wyeth. He was a famous painter. He would illustrate books. He painted pictures of presidents. He was actually very well known. And he loved historical paintings. Back 100 years before his time, when the Indians and the trappers and all the people exploring this country, that he wanted all of his kids to be very creative. So what he would do is when he would go away on a trip to sell his paintings, He would buy his 5 children costumes, buy them little knight suits with wooden swords, or he would buy them Robin Hood outfits and give them little bows with rubber suction tip darts. And they would go out in the woods and beat on each other. And they would use their mind and strengthen their imagination. Did this work? Yes, it did. Every one of his kids went into a creative field. Andrew was the youngest. He became a painter. He had a sister who was a poet. He had another sister who was a writer. He had a brother who was a musician. And I believe the other brother was in the stage, went into stage and theater. So it worked. He made these kids creative. He would do stuff like climb on the roof at Christmas, and he'd ring jingle bells, and he'd put a head of Santa Claus coming down the fireplace with glowing eyes. The glowing eyes was a mistake because Andrew saw this at 4 years old and got scared and ran upstairs and wet the bed. Unfortunately, N.C. Wyeth died when Andrew was 14. He was crossing a train track in Pennsylvania. There were no warning lights. He forgot to look, and a train ended up hitting his car. But Andrew did learn to paint from him when he was young. And at 11, he came into his father's studio, and his father took this musket from this picture, make sure I got that up right, and he put it down on the table. And he told him, draw it. So Andrew drew it. And then he grabbed the gun and he turned the gun just a little. And he said, draw it. And Andrew went, all right. So he drew it again. Then he turned it a little and he drew it again. And he turned it and he drew it again. And he flipped it and he drew it again. And then he'd wake Andrew up right in the early morning when the sunbeams were just cracking through the studio windows. And he'd make him draw that musket again. And he would get him late at night when the twilight was setting. He'd make him draw it again. According to the stories, and I normally say according to the stories, because for every story out there about an artist, you can find a story that contradicts it. But he drew that gun anywhere between 2,000 and 6,000 times. It was to the point where he could close his eyes and tell you where the powder burns were on that gun. Or he could tell you what parts had been worn from somebody's hand grabbing it for 100 years, or what color the metal was at what point, or even the grain of the wood that the gun was made out of. He could so perfectly picture that in his head that he no longer needed to have that object in front of him. But once again, 2,000 to 6,000 times. I don't have that kind of attention span. There on the left, you see one of his many, many sketches for this painting here, which was called The Spring. That's where the farmers got their water. I thought that was a cleaner painting. I really did when I posted it. This is another famous one that is the bedroom window. Now, there were 2 ways to possibly paint this thing. You could have painted it all flat in one layer, or you could have painted the window and all that first, and then very lightly and transparently painted the drapes over the front of it. And that's how most people, not everybody, because that doesn't work for everybody, but that's how most people paint. They finish the form that's underneath, then they draw what's on top if it's difficult. He worked in tempera paints. And if you think back to grade school, and you think of those paints they made you use that were horrible and chalky and nasty, he would use those same paints, but he would take the white from egg yolks and he'd mix that in with that paint so that when it dried, it would be a more permanent, more malleable type of paint. All right, so they have some kind of auction going down there. I don't know if they're auctioning off cows in Pennsylvania or whatever they were doing back in 1948. But you definitely get a sense of the ruts in the road and how people just drove across fields because there were no roads. All right, his son Jamie also is a realist, but sometimes he puts a little flair on it where he, there's a giant jack-o'-lantern dude here. He's not on a horse. He's not after Ichabod Crane, but it's got that vibe to it. And he would also do these portraits of everyday people, you know, nobody famous. Although he did paint Kennedy, and he got pretty well known for that too. But this one is just amazing. The amount of texture in the skin and the puffiness under the eyes. You feel like you may have met this guy at some point. Let's talk about our realism rules. You have a set of 5 realism rules that if you follow these rules, and N.C. Wyeth used them, Andrew Wyeth used them, Jamie used them. Jamie's daughter didn't use them because she is a photographer. So if she would have painted, that would have been 4 generations in a row that were painters. First rule, draw slowly. On the final test, I may ask you why drawing slowly is important. Yep. You could say stuff like trying to get you slower you go, the better connection between eye and hand. There's a whole list of reasons. You only got to give me one. All right, number 3, draw from life. And at some point, even though Andrew Wyeth could draw from his imagination, he did draw from life over and over and over and over again until it was in his mind. So that's kind of a key. Or if you have to, draw from a photograph. I love rhinos. I like to draw rhinos. I will never own a rhino. Oh, well. At least I don't have to pick up after a rhino. Draw from life for a photo. Like, it would be much safer for me to draw a rhino from a photo. Number 4, the second most important, look at what you're drawing more than your paper. Your paper will try to seduce you. So you really want to take your time and look at that object so that your brain doesn't start making things up while you're staring at your paper. Your brain's your best friend and your worst enemy. I mean, it can entertain you, or it could go, I don't want to do that, so I want to think these thoughts. And then you don't realize what you're supposed to be paying attention to. So that's why you got to look at which draw more on paper. And number 5, I wrote don't erase. Here's why. If you know every line you have to put down is a line you're going to live with, you will go slower. Now, that doesn't mean everything in this class we're never going to use an eraser. We will, especially when we go into comic book art, because we make a lot of that up out of our left brain. But when we are doing realism, the slower we go, the better chance you're going to get it right if you know it has to be right the first time. All right? So here's what we're going to do. When I see you guys on Thursday, find an object you want to draw. And we're not going to draw anything 2,000 times because I would get bored doing that too. But I want you to get an object other than your cell phone, something that's got some form to it, maybe an old toy, or you got a sister or brother with toys at home that are not video games, something that we can turn around so you can see, you know, one side of it, the other side of it, the other side of it, the top, the bottom. We're going to draw this thing from 6 different views. I'll let you pick the object. Once again, that's boring. Don't grab your cell phone. So you guys have a good day. Try to make it to class on time on Thursday. Bring your object. Bring a paper and bring pencil. All right. Any questions? Awesome.
Nope.
Have yourself a good day, guys.